I'm 32 now, and I still think about the lecture hall sometimes. Not the whole building, just room 142 in the Palmer Engineering Complex, where Professor Adelaide Crane taught her advanced robotics seminar every Tuesday and Thursday at 2 in the afternoon. The room had these old wooden seats that creaked when you shifted your weight, and there was a water stain on the ceiling in the shape of something that looked almost like a bird if you stared at it long enough during lectures you weren't really part of. I stared at it a lot during my junior year at Cornell. It's been 8 years since I graduated. 8 years since I walked across that stage with Latin honors and a degree in mechanical engineering. 8 years since I left behind the version of myself who believed that innovation mattered more than presentation, that ideas stood on their own merit, that the best work would inevitably rise to the surface. I was naive about all of that, but what I learned in being naive was more valuable than any course I took. That sometimes the people who take credit for your work teach you exactly how to build something they can never claim. Something with your name on it that no one can erase. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about what happens when someone decides your contributions don't count, and how you prove them wrong without ever confronting them directly. How you become undeniable not through volume, but through precision. I came to Cornell knowing exactly what I wanted to do. Robotics. Specifically, soft robotics. The emerging field focused on building machines with flexible, compliant materials instead of rigid metal frames. Robots that could work alongside humans safely. Robots that could adapt to unpredictable environments. It was the future, and I wanted to be part of building it. My high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Yamamoto, had been the one who'd encouraged me to aim high. "You've got the mind for it, Adrian," she'd told me senior year, looking over my college applications. "You see problems differently than other students. That's valuable." I'd gotten into Cornell's engineering program with a partial scholarship. Not a full ride. My family wasn't poor enough for maximum aid, but we weren't wealthy enough to pay full tuition either. I worked in the dining hall 15 hours a week to make up the difference. Scrambled eggs at 6 a.m., returned trays at noon, mopped floors at closing. But I didn't mind. I was at Cornell. I was studying engineering. I was exactly where I needed to be. I first heard about Professor Crane during freshman orientation. She was a legend in the department, one of the youngest people ever to get tenure at Cornell, a MacArthur Fellow, someone who'd published groundbreaking work on biomimetic actuators. She'd been featured in TED Talks, profiled in the New York Times, invited to consult for companies like Boston, Dynamics, and NASA. Everyone wanted to work in her lab, but she only took the best students. The ones with perfect GPAs, impressive research experience, connections to other prominent researchers. The ones who looked good on grant applications. I spent freshman and sophomore year building my resume. I aced every class. I volunteered in 2 different labs, doing grunt work, cleaning equipment, running errands, organizing data. I taught myself Python and MATLAB. I read every paper Professor Crane had published, studying her methodologies, understanding her approach. By the end of sophomore year, I had a 3.9 GPA and strong letters of recommendation from 2 professors. I applied to Professor Crane's lab for the following fall. I got an interview. The interview was in her office in early April. The space was smaller than I'd expected, crammed with books and prototypes and papers stacked in precarious towers. Professor Crane herself was in her early 40s, with short-cropped, gray hair and glasses that she kept pushing up her nose while she talked. "So Adrian," she'd said, scanning my application, "why soft robotics?" "Because rigid systems have fundamental limitations in unpredictable environments. Compliance allows for adaptive interaction. It's the difference between a tool and a partner." She'd smiled slightly. Textbook answer. "What do you actually care about?" I'd pause, trying to read what she wanted. "I care about building things that matter, things that help people, Soft robotics has applications in medicine, in disaster response, in assistive technology. I want to work on problems that have real-world impact. Everyone says that. I know, but I mean it. She'd studied me for a long moment. Your grades are excellent. Your recommendations are solid, but you don't have any significant research experience. Why should I take you over candidates who've already published? Because I'll work harder than anyone else in the lab, because I'll learn faster, because I care more about the work than about getting my name on papers. That last part had been true when I said it. It wouldn't stay true. All right, Professor Crane had said, I'll give you a spot. But understand, this is a competitive environment. I expect excellence, I expect initiative, and I expect you to contribute to the lab's success, not just your own. I understand. We'd shaken hands. Hers was firm, professional, brief. I started in the lab that September. There were 8 of us total, 7 graduate students and me, the only undergraduate. The grad students were brilliant, intense, driven. They worked 80-hour weeks. They spoke in jargon I barely understood. They'd already published papers, won awards, presented at conferences. I was the rookie. The first few weeks were overwhelming. I was assigned to assist a 4th-year PhD student named Marcus Chen on a project involving pneumatic actuators for a robotic gripper. My job was basic, running tests, collecting data, maintaining equipment. Marcus was polite but distant, clearly more interested in his dissertation than in mentoring an undergrad. I didn't mind. I absorbed everything. I stayed late in the lab, reading papers, watching the grad students work, learning the tools and techniques. Professor Crane held lab meetings every Friday afternoon. We'd go around the room, each person presenting their progress from the week. The meetings were intense. She'd interrupt presentations to ask probing questions, challenge assumptions, push people to think harder. I mostly stayed quiet those first few months, listened, learned. In November, something shifted. I'd been working on a data analysis task for Marcus, looking at pressure curves from different actuator designs. The work was tedious, but I'd noticed something odd. There was a consistent anomaly in the readings at a specific pressure threshold. A small spike that shouldn't have been there. I'd spent a weekend digging into it, running additional tests, checking the calibration of our sensors, and I'd discovered the issue. There was a design flaw in how we were measuring pressure. The sensors were positioned too close to the actuator joints, creating interference. I'd written up a brief memo explaining the problem and a proposed solution, repositioning the sensors and recalibrating our measurement protocol. I'd shown it to Marcus on Monday morning. He'd read it, frowned. Huh? Yeah, I think you might be right. Let me check with Adelaide. That Friday's lab meeting, Marcus had presented my finding as part of his update. He'd explained the measurement issue, the solution, the implications for our data quality. Professor Crane had been impressed. Good catch, Marcus. This could have skewed our entire analysis. Thanks. It took some digging to figure out. I'd waited for him to mention that I'd been the one who'd actually found it. He hadn't. After the meeting, I'd pulled him aside. Hey, Marcus, you didn't mention that I was the one who identified the sensor issue. He'd looked uncomfortable. Oh, yeah, sorry about that. I figured since you were working under my supervision, it fell under my project update. But you're right. I should have credited you. Would you mind mentioning it to Professor Crane? Sure, yeah. I'll send her an email. I never knew if he did. She never said anything to me about it. That incident planted a seed of something I didn't quite have words for yet. Unease, maybe. A sense that the rules weren't quite what I'd thought they were, but I pushed it aside. It was one small thing. It didn't mean anything, except it kept happening. Winter break came and went. Spring semester started. I'd proven myself enough that Professor Crane gave me my own small project. developing a prototype for a soft robotic finger that could handle delicate objects without crushing them. It was preliminary research, nothing groundbreaking, but it was mine. I threw myself into it. I spent every free hour in the lab. I read dozens of papers on tactile sensors, material properties, control algorithms. I built prototype after prototype, each one a refinement of the last. By March, I had something that actually worked. A 3-fingered gripper that could pick up an egg without breaking it, manipulate a paper cup without crushing it, handle objects with varying textures and weights. I was proud of it, more proud than I'd been of anything I'd built before. I showed it to Professor Crane during one of her office hours. She'd examined it carefully, testing the fingers, asking questions about the materials, the control system, the sensing feedback. "This is good work, Adrian. Really good. The sensitivity is impressive." "Thank you. I'm going to have you present this at the next lab meeting. I think it could be the foundation for a larger project." I'd left her office walking on air. That Friday, I presented my prototype. I'd prepared carefully, slides explaining the design principles, videos demonstrating the gripper's capabilities, data showing its performance metrics. I walked the lab through my entire process, the iterations, the failures, the solutions. The grad students asked good questions, tough questions. I answered them as best I could. Professor Crane had watched the whole presentation with an inscrutable expression. When I finished, she'd nodded. "This has real potential. I think we should expand it into a full research project. Adrian, you'll continue leading the technical development, but I'm going to pair you with Gabrielle to help with the theoretical framework and publication strategy." Gabrielle Lindholm was a third-year PhD student. Brilliant, polished, the kind of person who could explain complex concepts with effortless clarity. She'd already published 4 papers as first author. "Gabrielle, I'd like you to work with Adrian to develop this into something we can submit to ICRA." ICRA, the International Conference on Robotics and Automation, one of the top venues in the field. Gabrielle had smiled. "Sure, Adelaide, happy to help." At first, working with Gabrielle was great. She was smart, organized, generous with her expertise. We met twice a week to discuss progress. She helped me frame my technical work in the broader context of soft robotics research. She suggested experiments I hadn't thought of, pointed out potential weaknesses in my approach, helped me think through implications. I was learning more than I had in any class, but gradually something started to shift. In our meetings, Gabrielle began taking more control of the project direction. "I think we should focus on the theoretical contributions," she'd say. "The prototype is interesting, but what's really novel is the control algorithm. That's what reviewers will care about." She started rewriting sections of our shared documents without discussing it with me first. Started making design decisions without asking my input. When I'd push back, gently, because I didn't want to seem difficult, she'd smile and say, "Trust me, Adrian. I've been through this process before. I know what conferences are looking for." I told myself she was helping, that she knew better, that I should be grateful for her mentorship. By April, the project had evolved significantly from my original prototype. We'd added complexity to the control system. We'd run additional experiments focusing on algorithmic optimization rather than mechanical design. The work was still good, maybe even better technically, but it felt different, less mine. Our abstract got accepted to ICRA. We'd be presenting in May. Professor Crane had called us both into her office to discuss the paper submission. "Excellent work, both of you. Gabrielle, I'd like you to take the lead on writing the final paper. Adrian, you'll contribute the technical sections, but Gabrielle has more experience with the publication process." "What about author order?" I'd asked. Professor Crane had looked at me. Gabriel will be first author, you'll be second, I'll be senior author, obviously. But I'd stop myself. Yes, I developed the original prototype. The core idea was mine. And Gabrielle developed it into a publishable research contribution. First authorship goes to whoever makes the largest intellectual contribution. In this case, that's Gabrielle. I'd looked at Gabrielle. She'd avoided my eyes. I understand if you're disappointed, Professor Crane had continued. But this is how collaborative research works. Everyone contributes. Not everyone can be first author. I didn't argue. What could I say? That it felt unfair? That I'd done the hardest work? That without my prototype, there'd be no paper at all? It would have sounded like whining, like I didn't understand how academic research worked. So I smiled and said, "Of course. Thank you for the opportunity." And I went back to my dorm and stared at the ceiling for 3 hours. My roommate junior year was a guy named Hiroshi Tanaka, a computer science major who spent most of his time gaming and complaining about his algorithm's homework. He'd noticed I was upset. "What's wrong, man?" I'd told him everything. The project, the authorship, the feeling that something had been taken from me. Hiroshi had shrugged. "That's academia, dude. The people with power take credit. The people without power do the work." "That's depressing." "Yeah, but it's also reality. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" I hadn't known how to answer that. The ICRA conference was in Seattle that year. Professor Crane paid for Gabrielle to attend. She didn't pay for me. "Budget constraints," she'd explained. "I can only send one student. Since Gabrielle is presenting, it makes sense for her to go. But I'm second author." "I understand, but these are the decisions I have to make." I watched the presentation via live stream from my dorm room. Gabrielle did a great job. She explained the work clearly, answered questions confidently, made the research sound exciting and important. Our paper, the gripper I'd built in my hands with my ideas, was out in the world with someone else's name first. I felt hollow. I stayed on campus, working in the lab full-time. Professor Crane had a new project she wanted to explore, a modular soft robot system for search and rescue applications. She assigned me to the team. This time, I was working with 2 grad students, Gabrielle again, and a second year named Priya Reddy. The project was ambitious. We were designing robots that could squeeze through rubble, navigate unstable terrain, carry sensors into dangerous environments. It was exactly the kind of high-impact work I'd wanted to do. I was responsible for the locomotion system, figuring out how to make the robot move efficiently across different surfaces. It was hard, really hard. I spent 6 weeks testing different designs, running simulations, building prototypes that failed more often than they succeeded, but eventually I figured it out. A hybrid system that combined pneumatic bladders with gecko-inspired adhesion. It worked on concrete, on gravel, on inclines up to 45 degrees. I showed Professor Crane during one of our project meetings. She'd been genuinely excited. "Adrian, this is breakthrough work. This could be the centerpiece of our NSF grant proposal." I'd felt that familiar flutter of pride and hope. "I'm going to have you write up the technical specifications," she'd continued. "Gabrielle, you'll integrate it into the broader system design. Priya, you'll handle the sensor package integration." Over the next month, I watched my locomotion system get incorporated into the larger project. Watched it become just one component of a bigger whole. Watched the presentation of the work shift from Adrian's adhesion system to our modular locomotion approach. When Professor Crane submitted the NSF grant in August, she'd shown me the proposal. My locomotion system was featured prominently. The technical specifications I'd written were in the appendix. My name appeared once, in the acknowledgments. "We thank undergraduate researcher Adrian Park for his assistance with preliminary prototype development. Assistance, preliminary. I'd invented the core technology that made the entire robot viable. Senior year started with a decision I'd been avoiding. I needed to figure out what I was doing after graduation. Grad school, industry, something else. Professor Crane called me into her office in September. "Adrian, I wanted to talk to you about your future plans. I've been thinking about grad school, staying in robotics. I think that's a good path for you. You've shown real technical aptitude. Have you thought about where you want to apply? I was hoping to stay here, at Cornell, maybe in your lab." She'd paused. "That's flattering, but I should be honest with you. I don't typically take students from undergrad directly into my PhD program. I prefer students with diverse backgrounds, fresh perspectives." "Oh, I didn't realize. However, I'd be happy to write you a strong recommendation letter. You'd be competitive at most top programs." It was a kind rejection, but it was still a rejection. What if I wanted to continue working on the search and rescue robot project? Gabrielle is taking that on as her dissertation. She'll be leading it moving forward. Of course she was. I see. But I meant what I said, Adrian. You have a bright future. You just need to find the right fit. I left her office knowing something I'd been trying not to know for a year and a half. Professor Crane saw me as a resource, not a researcher. A skilled pair of hands, not a mind worth investing in. The realization hurt less than I'd expected, maybe because part of me had known all along. I talked to my academic advisor, Professor Norman Willis, a few days later. He was an older man, late 60s, who taught undergraduate design courses and actually cared about his students. I told him everything. The authorship issues, the credit problems, the feeling of being systematically sidelined. He'd listened without interrupting. Then he'd said, "Adrian, what you're describing isn't unusual. Unfortunately, young researchers, especially undergrads, often get exploited. Their ideas get absorbed into larger projects. Their contributions get minimized. It's one of the ugly realities of academic research." "So there's nothing I can do?" "That's not what I said. There are several things you can do. Question is, what do you want to accomplish?" "I want credit for my work. I want my ideas to matter." "Then stop giving them away." I'd looked at him, confused. "You're about to graduate," Professor Willis continued. "You have a strong technical foundation. You have ideas. You don't need Adelaide Crane to validate those ideas. You need to build something yourself, something with your name on it that no one can claim." "Like what?" "That's for you to figure out, but my advice? Document everything you've done. Every prototype, every test, every innovation. Build a portfolio that shows what you're capable of, and then take it somewhere that will actually value you." I spent the rest of September documenting my work. I photographed every prototype I'd built. I compiled my test data. I wrote detailed descriptions of my design processes, my problem-solving approaches, my innovations. I created a portfolio website showcasing 3 years of robotics projects. Not just the work from Professor Crane's lab, but everything. Side projects, coursework, independent experiments. I realized something while building that portfolio. I'd actually accomplished a lot, more than I'd given myself credit for. The problem wasn't that I lacked ability or ideas. The problem was that I'd been channeling all of it into a system designed to extract my labor while minimizing my recognition. In October, I applied to grad schools. Not to stay in academia, I'd lost my taste for that, but to industry research labs. Places like Google, Apple, Tesla, where the work was collaborative, but the credit was clearer. I also started working on something else. A personal project, completely independent of Professor Crane's lab. I wanted to build something that solved a real problem, something tangible. I'd been thinking about my grandmother. She'd had a stroke 2 years earlier and lost much of the fine motor control in her left hand. Simple tasks, buttoning a shirt, opening a jar, holding a toothbrush, had become difficult or impossible. What if I built a soft, robotic assistive device for stroke survivors? Something lightweight, wearable that could augment hand function without being bulky or stigmatizing? It was ambitious. Maybe too ambitious for a senior thesis project. But Professor Willis, when I pitched it to him, had been enthusiastic. "Do it. I'll be your advisor. This is exactly the kind of work that showcases your abilities." I spent the fall semester building the prototype. I designed a glove with embedded pneumatic actuators that could assist finger flexion. I developed a control system that responded to the wearer's residual muscle signals. I 3D printed components, sewed fabric interfaces, programmed microcontrollers in my dorm room at 2 a.m. Hiroshi would come home from the library and find me surrounded by parts and wires. "You're obsessed, man." "I know. It's cool, though, what you're building. My aunt had a stroke. Something like this would have helped her." That's what kept me going. The idea that this could actually matter to someone. By December, I had a working prototype. It wasn't perfect. The actuators were a bit loud. The control system needed refinement, but it worked. I could put it on someone's hand and watch them regain the ability to grasp objects they couldn't hold before. I took it to a local rehabilitation clinic and asked if any of their patients would be willing to test it. 3 people volunteered. The feedback was incredible. One woman, a retired teacher named Dorothy, cried when she was able to button her sweater for the first time in 18 months. "You have no idea what this means," she'd said. "It's not just the button. It's the feeling of being capable again." I documented everything, took videos, recorded feedback, measured functional improvements. This was mine, completely mine. No one could take credit for it. I presented my thesis in April. The defense was in front of a committee of 3 professors. Professor Willis, a biomechanics specialist named Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, and 1 other faculty member from mechanical engineering. Professor Crane wasn't on the committee. She didn't need to be. It wasn't her project. I presented for 30 minutes, showed my prototype, demonstrated its functionality, shared feedback from users, discussed technical challenges and solutions. The committee asked tough questions. I answered them. At the end, they'd asked me to step outside while they deliberated. I'd stood in the hallway for 10 minutes, heart pounding. Professor Willis opened the door. "Congratulations, Adrian. Outstanding work. We're awarding highest honors." The thesis garnered some attention. The Cornell Engineering School featured it in their newsletter. A local news station did a short segment on it. A medical device company reached out to ask if I'd be interested in discussing the technology. And then, 2 weeks before graduation, I got an email from Professor Crane. "Adrian, I saw your thesis presentation was very successful. Congratulations. I was wondering if you'd be interested in discussing how we might incorporate some of your assistive device work into our lab's research portfolio. I think there could be some interesting synergies. Let's find time to talk." I read the email 3 times, then I deleted it. The industry I graduated in May with a 3.87 GPA and a job offer from a robotics startup in Boston called Adaptive Systems. They'd seen my portfolio. They'd been impressed by my thesis. They'd offered me a position as a junior robotics engineer with equity and a salary that was more money than I'd ever imagined making. I accepted. My parents came to graduation. They were proud, though I could tell they didn't quite understand why I wasn't going to grad school. "You worked so hard to get into Professor Crane's lab," my mom had said. "And now you're just leaving?" "I learned what I needed to learn there, Mom. Time to do something else." Adaptive Systems was different from academia in every way that mattered. The work was collaborative, but the contributions were clear. We had project leads, but everyone's input was valued. When you came up with a good idea, It got implemented, and your name stayed attached to it. I was on a team developing soft robotic grippers for warehouse automation. The technology was similar to what I'd worked on at Cornell, but the applications were commercial rather than theoretical. I thrived. Within 6 months, I'd filed my first patent, a novel sensor configuration for tactile feedback and soft grippers. My name was on it, just mine and the company's. Within a year, I was promoted to mid-level engineer. Within 18 months, I was leading my own small team. But I couldn't stop thinking about the assistive device. I'd built it for my thesis and then left it behind. The prototype was sitting in a box in my apartment. The feedback from users had been so positive, but I'd done nothing with it. I started working on it nights and weekends, refining the design, making it quieter, lighter, more responsive. I filed a provisional patent on my own, separate from my work at Adaptive Systems. I reached out to the rehabilitation clinic where I'd done my initial testing. They connected me with more patients. I iterated based on their feedback. And then I did something I'd never done before. I started a company. Just a simple LLC at first. Adrian Park, sole proprietor. But it was mine. I called it Reclaim Robotics. Building a company while working full-time was brutal. I was sleeping maybe 5 hours a night. I spent every weekend in a makerspace I'd rented in Somerville, building prototypes, testing designs, meeting with potential users. Hiroshi, who'd moved to Boston for a software job, would come by sometimes and shake his head. "Dude, you're going to burn out." "I'm fine. You're running on coffee and spite." He wasn't entirely wrong about the spite part. Every time I worked on the assistive device, I thought about Professor Crane's email, about the assumption that she could just absorb my work into her research portfolio, that my ideas were raw materials for her to refine and claim. This was the antidote to that. Work that was undeniably, indelibly mine. By the end of my second year at Adaptive Systems, I had a functional product. The Reclaim Glove, a soft robotic assistive device for stroke survivors and others with hand mobility impairments. It was sleeker than my thesis prototype, quieter, more comfortable. The control system was sophisticated enough to adapt to different users' needs. I'd gotten it tested at 3 different rehabilitation centers. The feedback was consistently positive. I'd also gotten it certified as a Class II medical device, a grueling process that involved mountains of documentation and regulatory compliance. And then I launched a Kickstarter. The Kickstarter was modest. I was asking for $50,000 to fund an initial production run of 100 devices. I made a video showing the glove in action, featuring interviews with users, explaining the technology in accessible terms. I launched it on a Tuesday morning and told myself I'd be happy if I hit the goal in a month. I hit it in 4 days. By the end of the campaign, I'd raised $340,000. The success of the Kickstarter changed everything. Suddenly I had capital, I had customers, I had proof that people wanted what I'd built. I also had a decision to make. Keep working at Adaptive Systems and run Reclaim as a side project, or go all in on building the company. I talked to my parents. My dad thought I should stay at Adaptive. Stable job, good salary, why risk it? My mom was more ambivalent. "What do you want, Adrian?" I wanted to build something that mattered. I gave notice at Adaptive Systems. The first year of running Reclaim full-time was the hardest year of my professional life. I was CEO, lead engineer, customer service department, and janitor all rolled into one. I hired a contract manufacturer to build the devices. I personally handled quality control, checking every single unit before it shipped. I responded to customer emails at midnight. I troubleshot technical issues over video calls with users. It was exhausting. It was also the most fulfilling work I'd ever done, because every device I shipped was helping someone. Every email I got from a user who could button their shirt again, hold their grandchild's hand, feel capable, those made every late night worth it. By year 2, Reclaim had grown enough that I could hire help. I brought on a part-time operations manager, a contract engineer to help with design iterations, a customer support specialist. We shipped 800 devices that year. We got written up in a medical technology journal. We started getting inquiries from insurance companies about coverage. And then, in my 3rd year of running Reclaim, I got an unexpected email. It was from a graduate student at Cornell, someone I didn't know. "Hi Adrian, I'm a PhD student in Professor Crane's lab. I saw your work with Reclaim Robotics and I'm really impressed. I wanted to reach out because Professor Crane is working on a similar project and I thought there might be opportunities for collaboration. Would you be interested in talking?" I stared at the email for a long time. Then I wrote back, "Thank you for reaching out. I appreciate the interest, but I'm not looking for collaborators at this time. Best of luck with your research." 4 years after graduation, Reclaim Robotics had become a real company. We had 15 employees. We'd shipped over 3,000 devices. We had partnerships with 5 major rehabilitation hospital networks. We'd raised a Series A funding round of $4 million, and we were profitable. I was 26 years old and running a medical device company that was actually helping people. The recognition started to come. Forbes featured me in their 30 under 30 list for healthcare technology. I was invited to speak at conferences about entrepreneurship and assistive technology. MIT Technology Review named the Reclaim Glove one of their breakthrough technologies of the year. And then I got an invitation that surprised me. Cornell wanted me to come back and give a talk for engineering students about transitioning from academia to entrepreneurship. I almost said no, but Professor Willis reached out personally. "Adrian, I think you should do this, not for Adelaide, for the students who are where you were, who need to see that there are other paths." He was right. I said yes. I came back to Cornell on a Thursday in October. The campus looked the same. The trees were showing their fall colors. Students were rushing between classes. Palmer Hall loomed with the same institutional grandeur. My talk was in the same lecture hall where I'd taken thermodynamics junior year. There were maybe 120 students in attendance, a mix of undergrads and grad students. Professor Willis introduced me, gave a brief overview of my background, my company, my work. And then I talked. I told them the truth. I told them about working in Professor Crane's lab, about building prototypes and watching credit go elsewhere, about having my ideas absorbed into other people's projects, about the choice I'd faced, accept that system or build something outside of it. I told them about the assistive device, about my grandmother, about Dorothy, the retired teacher who'd cried over a button. I told them about the fear of starting a company, about the nights I'd been sure I was failing, about the slow, grinding work of building something from nothing. And I told them about the moment I'd realized that success wasn't about being recognized by the people who'd overlooked me. It was about building something so undeniable that recognition became irrelevant. The validation I needed didn't come from a professor or a publication or a prestigious lab, I said. It came from users who told me I'd changed their lives. That's the metric that matters. The students asked good questions about fundraising, about technical challenges, about work-life balance, about whether I regretted not getting a PhD. I don't regret it, I said. Not because academia is bad, it's not, but because I found a path that aligned with what I actually valued: impact, independence, building things that help people. If your path is different, that's fine. But don't stay on a path that's wrong for you, just because you think you're supposed to. After the talk, students came up to ask more questions, to share their own experiences of feeling overlooked, to ask for advice. And then, as the room was clearing out, I saw her. Professor Crane was standing near the back, arms crossed, watching. We made eye contact. She approached. Adrian, that was quite a talk. Thank you. I wanted to say I'm impressed by what you've built. Reclaim is doing important work. I appreciate that. A pause. I'll be honest, I was surprised when you didn't respond to my email after graduation. I thought there could have been some fruitful collaboration. I thought about several different responses, about everything I could say, about the authorship disputes, the credit issues, the years of feeling invisible, but what would be the point? I needed to build something on my own, I said simply, without any ambiguity about whose work it was. She studied me. You think I didn't give you adequate recognition? I think we had different perspectives on what adequate recognition looked like. Academic collaboration is complex, Adrian. Ideas build on each other. Credit is rarely clear-cut. You're right, which is why I chose a different model. Another pause. Well, she said, for what it's worth, I think you made the right choice. You're clearly thriving, and your work is making a real difference. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even really an acknowledgement of what had happened, but it was something. Thank you, Professor Crane. I appreciate that. We shook hands. Hers was still firm, professional, brief. And then she left. Professor Willis found me afterward. How are you feeling? Okay, actually, better than I expected. She's not going to change, you know. People like Adelaide, they're brilliant. They do important work, but they have blind spots. She genuinely doesn't see what she does to students like you. I know, but it doesn't matter anymore. She can't touch what I've built. Professor Willis smiled. No, she can't. That's the point. I'm 32 now. Reclaim Robotics has grown beyond anything I imagined when I started it. We have 40 employees. We've shipped over 15,000 devices. We're working on new products. A robotic walker for people with Parkinson's, a wearable device for children with cerebral palsy. We were acquired last year by a larger medical device company for an amount that made my parents finally understand why I'd left academia. But I stayed on as Chief Technology Officer, still leading the engineering team, still building. Last month, my assistive glove project was featured in a case study in a textbook on rehabilitation robotics. My name was listed as the inventor. The work was described accurately as my senior thesis project at Cornell that became the foundation for a company. Professor Crane was cited in the references. Her work on soft robotics had influenced the field broadly. But she wasn't part of this story. She couldn't be, because I'd built it somewhere she couldn't reach. I got an email recently from that graduate student who'd contacted me years ago about collaboration. She'd graduated and was working at a robotics company now. I wanted to thank you, she wrote, not just for declining the collaboration request, though looking back, I understand why you did, but for the talk you gave at Cornell. I was in the audience. It made me realize I didn't have to stay in a situation where my work wasn't valued. I left Adelaide's lab 6 months later, and I've never been happier. I wrote back, I'm glad. You deserve to work somewhere that sees you. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd stayed in academia, if I'd accepted the author order on that first paper, if I'd gone to grad school, if I'd tried to build a career in Professor Crane's shadow, waiting for scraps of recognition. I'd probably be finishing a PhD right now. Maybe I'd have a few publications. Maybe I'd be competitive for a postdoc somewhere. But I wouldn't have helped 15,000 people regain function in their hands. I wouldn't have built a company. I wouldn't have learned what I was actually capable of when no one was in my way. My grandmother passed away 2 years ago. She never got to use the final version of the glove. By the time it was ready, her condition had progressed too far. But she'd seen the prototype. She'd watched me work on it during visits home. I'm proud of you, Adrian, she'd said once. Not because you're building something fancy, because you're building something that helps. That stayed with me. Not the Forbes list or the funding rounds or the acquisition, but the knowledge that the work helps. I still dream about that lecture hall sometimes. Room 142, Palmer Engineering Complex. The water stain on the ceiling that looked like a bird. But in the dreams now, I'm not staring at the ceiling waiting for something to happen. I'm walking out, and I'm carrying something with me, a prototype, an idea, a seed of something that will grow into something undeniable, something with my name on it, something no one can take away. Last week, I got a LinkedIn message from someone I hadn't thought about in years. Gabrielle Lindholm. She'd left academia too, she told me, was working at a tech company. She'd been thinking about our time in Professor Crane's lab. I owe you an apology, she wrote. I was so focused on building my career that I didn't think about what it meant to put my name first on work that was really yours. I was young and ambitious, and I convinced myself it was just how things worked. But it wasn't right. I'm sorry. I read the message several times. Then I wrote back, "Thank you for saying that. It means something. For what it's worth, I don't carry any anger about it anymore. That experience taught me what I needed to learn, that I had to build things on my own terms. So in a weird way, I'm grateful. And I meant it. Because the truth is, I wouldn't be here without those years of being overlooked, without the anger that pushed me to build something independent, without the proof that working harder wasn't enough. I needed to work differently. I needed to stop waiting for someone else to validate my worth and start demonstrating it myself. That's the lesson. Not that the system is fair, or that hard work always pays off, or that justice eventually prevails, but that you can build something so undeniable that the question of recognition becomes irrelevant. You can become the architect of your own validation, and once you do, the people who tried to make you invisible don't matter anymore, because you're finally, completely, undeniably visible. Just not to them, to yourself. And that was enough. Stories like this happen more often than we think. Subscribe if you want to hear the ones that usually stay unspoken. And if this story made you pause, a like helps the channel grow.